This session is called Counterhuman, a title which is taken from the latest monograph by Professor Laura Brown, the John Wendell Anderson Professor of English at Cornell University. Her book, The Counterhuman Imaginary, Earthquake, Lapdogs, and Traveling Coinage in 18th-Century Literature, was published by Cornell University in November 2023, just a few months ago. The book has a great significance to us in the Rethinking Fable groups, keen as we are on exploring fresh approaches to understanding non-human fables. Thus, I'm delighted that Laura today will be giving us a session on some of the theoretical concepts she explores in her book. Thank you so much, Laura. And let's take a moment to celebrate the release of her remarkable book. For those who haven't had the chance to read it yet, I've shared the flyer in the chat with a discount code. Please take a look, and congratulations, Laura, on your publication.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm really grateful to Professor Lucinda Cole for agreeing to chair the panel, as well as acting as a respondent to this workshop. Lucinda is a Conrad Humanities Scholar and Associate Professor of English at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she is also Affiliate Professor with the Institute of Sustainability, Energy, and the Environment. She is the author of the award-winning monograph Imperfect Creatures, Burning Literature and the Sciences of Life, 1600 to 1740. University of Michigan Press, 2016. She is now finishing a book on cattle moraines, contagion, and the medical posthumanities. And lastly, I'm very grateful to both Laura and Lucinda for their time and generosity in designing and leading this workshop, as well as for sharing their insights with the group. Thank you again, and I will pass you over to Lucinda.
Thank you, Kaori. Can you hear me? I'm okay. So thanks, Kaori, and everybody who has helped put together this this wonderful workshop. Since Kaori has provided some of the relevant details about Laura, I'm just going to skip ahead and say, although we're here to celebrate this most recent book, The Counterhuman Imaginary, Earthquakes, Lapdogs, Traveling Coinage in 18th-Century Literature, I want to begin with Laura's definition of a cultural fable from 2001's Fables of Modernity. And this is Laura. With this oxymoron, she writes in the introduction, I mean to yoke the material and the historical with the aesthetic, culture with fable, in a way that enables the simultaneous reading of both literature and history. As I deploy it here, the cultural fable is a formal construct in the sense that it is characterized by a set of related figures that have a distinctive structure or are in dynamic relationship. They intersect with and elaborate one another so to project a set of meanings, affects, or even ironies that constitute a common imaginative project, end quote. A cultural fable, then, is not necessarily coterminous with a single text, but a collective imaginative phenomenon through which modernity is constructed. Modernity is constituted imaginatively and discursively, she continues, by encounters with alterity. In this book, that is, in Cultural Fables, by an imaginative negotiation with the figure of the woman or of the non-European. Laura's Counterhuman Imaginary extends this long-standing preoccupation with alterity, but in the register of posthumanism, broadly speaking. It begins with a foundational question: how can the human depict the other than human? The next 5 chapters engage with some of literary theory's most popular paradigms, thing theory, new materialism, affect theory among them, in ways that elucidate what they have in common. In different ways, according to Laura, they project, quote, a counterhuman realm just outside the region of human creative purpose, just beyond explicit acknowledgement, just out of reach of the human cultural imaginary. This realm of just beyond, she argues, calls for a new understanding of symptomatic reading and, quote, the real conditions of existence. So, for someone who is in both, animal studies, environmental studies, and literary studies, this is pretty heady stuff. Our discussion is going to fall into 3 segments. During the first 10 or so minutes of each, Laura will introduce different pillars of her theoretical argument, and I'll be doing my best to draw out the implications of the counterhuman imaginary for animal studies, the environmental humanities, and maybe the field I've begun to call the medical posthumanities. Then it's your turn to ask questions and offer connections. And I realize that because there was a session earlier in this, because we're international, we may have to, there aren't as many people as there would normally be. If you like to, you can put questions and comments in the chat. And Cowrie, maybe you could sort of help me keep an eye on that, on the chat. In any case, we're hoping for, a wide ranging conversation about how, as humanists or post-humanists, it is possible or impossible to imagine and depict the other, the more than human beings and environmental events, quote, just out of reach of the human cultural imaginary. So Laura, get us started. Yay.
Yes, ready to go. Thanks so much, Lucinda. Thanks for making the connection with Fables of Modernity. I do have a real engagement somewhere with the fable per se that's ongoing. So even though I don't mention the fable in the Counterhuman Imaginary, this project just matched up very closely with the project of that book. And thanks to all of you who are here. Thanks for showing up for this conversation, where I'm hoping we can use some of the scenarios from the Counterhuman Imaginary to think in new ways about the fable. The Counterhuman Imaginary, that book looks for, as Lucinda is suggesting, a conceptually rigorous way of approaching the representation of the other than human in human representation, that is through literature. In other words, what happens when human creativity encounters that immense realm that is not human, but within which the human resides and writes? And I'm orienting that effort conceptually by engaging along the way with a set of theoretical scenarios that I think each offer a distinctive opportunity to conceptualize the literary engagement with the other than human, and I think is relevant to us for our work on rethinking the fables, which is so consistently engaged outside of or beyond the local and individual human, or beyond the conventional human protagonist of a conventional human narrative or novel. So as Lucinda is saying, I want to turn to 3 of those conceptual scenarios, and we'll spend about 15 minutes or 20 minutes in each case. I'll review the concept and read a bunch of quotes, and then we'll consider how that concept might help us reevaluate the fable. And you should have, Cowrie attached a page of citations, which you can use to follow along here. I'm not reading all of these out, but I'll touch on all of them as we move through new materialism, affect theory, and post-critique. And I wanted you to have it in front of you so that you could read along, or, I don't know, keep it in your files of citations.
Shall I share that screen with the quote? Maybe I can move along.
I don't know if that's excuse me. I don't know. I'm not sure that's necessary.
Okay.
I'm going to read most of what I need. I'll be reading it, so I think people can follow along orally. So first, I'm going to offer a very quick conceptual summary of new materialism, or thing theory, touching on the highlights of the conceptualization of new materialism, so that we can get our conversation about the fable going. And I'm going to highlight terms and concepts that are most useful to us. This is like a thumbnail approach, or maybe a Broadway musical approach to thing theory. So first, irrelevance to the human. In Jonathan Lamb's account from The Things Things Say, the provocative point right at the outset is purity. The thing is entirely removed from the human and is to be understood as, quote, things purely as they are. According to Lamb, these pure things disturb literary texts because they are, quote, obstinately solitary, superficial, and self-evident. And again, he says they are irrelevant to any human system. For Jane Bennett, the key term is vitality, like the title of her book, Vibrant Matter. The thing is vitally engaged and efficacious. So Bennett's enabling quality is thing power. And the impact of that power is transferable in that, now I'm quoting her, attentiveness to non-human things and their powers can have a laudable effect on humans. For Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost and their introduction to New Materialisms, which was an influential summary of the position, the emphasis for them is specifically ontological, extending beyond vitality to the actual agency of matter. The human species is no longer distinguished from other species by its agency. And here's their statement. I'm quoting them now. There is increasing agreement here that all bodies, including those of animals and perhaps certain machines too, evince certain capacities for agency. As a consequence, the human species and the qualities of self-reflection, self-awareness, and rationality traditionally used to distinguish it from the rest of nature may now seem little more than contingent and provisional forms or processes within a broader evolutionary or cosmic productivity. So they're arguing that material forces themselves manifest agentic capacities. That's a quote from them. And their key terms are active, self-creative, productive, which require rethinking of the whole edifice of modern ontology regarding change, causality, agency. And this vitality can be felt as a kind of autonomy. For example, in Bill Brown's reflection that, I love this one, quote, my concern is not with whether you succeed or fail to grasp things in themselves. My concern is how objects grasp you, how they elicit your attention, interrupt your concentration, assault your sensorium. So these statements are offering a really small, quick sample of current interpretations of the nature and the role of matter. Things might indicate a kind of purity or irrelevance to the human system. They certainly have their own vitality or vital efficacy, and thus might undercut traditional ontological assumptions about human distinctiveness or centrality. They might act on their own with a kind of power or thing power or force equivalent to or expansive of the category of being, or they might merge their powers with the forces of human activity. I'm thinking we can see the potential for taking these concepts to a rethinking of the fable. These new materialist definitions of the nature and role of matter or of the other than human might be exported to create a new definition of the fable. Does the fable or the fable protagonist tend to embody a distinctive form of vitality, agency, movement, or ontology? If the fable expresses a distinctive form of vitality, might it disrupt or undermine human structures of communication or expression? Or maybe fables or their protagonists might efficaciously merge their powers with the forces of human activity and expand the scenario of human thought through their vitality. Or they might act on their own with their own force, equivalent to the category of being. Or on the oppositional side, fables through their unique vitality might work to renegotiate or even undermine human structures or processes. So I talk about these opportunities around agency and autonomy, especially in relationship to Robinson Crusoe, where I'm all about the jar being in charge of the island. But I also deal with the so-called it narrative, where things are the supposed author and narrator. And I have seen 18th century it narratives be described as fables. The material thing, the sedan chair, the history of the guinea. So I'm eager to hear first, maybe from Lucinda, about how what kind of things we might do with new materialism in relationship to rethinking the fable.
Thanks, Laura. I feel as though I'm not quite prepared to talk about that, but let me take a stab. Let me take a stab at it. I mean, here's what occurs to me, and I warned you in advance that I might be drawing on this fable, the animals sick with the plague or animals ill with the plague, which is it's one of Aesop's fables that became really important. It seems to me, especially during periods of cattle plague. I'm talking about, enzootic, panzootics, in which animals were dying. But in the fable, you have several different animals, talking to each other, trying to decide about a sacrifice, whether or not, who's going to be the sacrificial animal. And ultimately, the ass, who says, well, yeah, I did eat some grass, is, is chosen, ironically, for this sacrificial, to be the sacrifice, which leads to the, moral that might is always, the greatest form of power. I mean, that there is no ethical relation apart from the relation of power. But in any case, I mean, that fable is indicative in many ways, in that it's a multi-species fable. And it's a multi-species fable that also seems to be arguably have some relationship. Now we get into all these issues of the real, which I had hoped to, think about later, but seems to have some relationship to actual phenomena, which can be read allegorically or cannot be read allegorically, either way. If you look at it through the lens of new materialism, I think one of the questions that comes up is, what is the actant there? How many actants are there? Is it the plague? Is it the environment? Is it these animals? So I just wonder if you could help me think through that. I mean, in terms of reading the fable, in terms of new materialism. And particularly, the kind of Jane Bennett vitalism.
Yep. Well, we should hear from other people if they're interested, but I'm especially excited at the idea of imagining the plague as a kind of protagonist of the fable, or the actant. The agency seems to be entirely in the plague rather than in the collective of animals responding to it. And so making the vital center of the fable something that is not at all human or even animal, really, is real. I mean, maybe that's a way of questioning, undermining, certainly problematizing the idea of human control, human management, human engagement with animals in a hierarchy, in a scenario of hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one way of looking at it, and it may not be this. That's obviously not the only one, but the idea of the agency, the idea of the plague's agency, is striking to me. And then the question of what that does to the scenario for either human agency or even animal-human relations is interesting.
Yeah. I think so too. And if anybody, by the way, our structure is not set in stone. If anybody has something to say, please, feel free to jump in here on this particular topic before I go on and ask another question about new materialism.
Let me add, the thing I like about your example is that it's implicating both other than human animals. It's implicating animals and a thing which is not really either animal or human. The triangulation around animals, humans, and then the plague is really a striking situation, and I'm not sure it's typical of the fables, that other fables that I know. So anyway, that's just an observation.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to remember. Erica Fudge wrote about fables in one of her books. You remember that? It's in relation to, I think it was maybe in relation to Plutarch. But I mean, she was mostly interested in the theophilic tradition of fabulation.
Mhm.
And it does seem to me that if you step outside of that tradition, that there are some really weird things going on with fables that would be, you know, amenable to some version of new materialism. Do you mind if I ask a broader question?
Go ahead, please.
And this is something that comes out of my own, wrestling with particularly Jane Bennett's new materialism, and the idea of thing power. And it has been accused of being like a mystification of rhetoric, which really doesn't bother me. I mean, it doesn't bother me when people say it's not philosophically rigorous enough. But there does seem to be, or it has been argued that her vital matters, that it's the first stage of a new materialism that has now kind of moved beyond itself, and that the next book, Influx and Efflux, writing up with Walt Whitman, maybe is this second stage. And it seems to differ by placing an anthropocentric concept. I mean, from the perspective of animal studies, anthropocentric concept, which is subjectivity, at the center of its inquiry, because her question, the emphasis is no longer on like the liveliness of living things or agency or any of those things, but a question. And here's her question: how to bespeak an I alive in a world of vibrant matter. How to write up its efforts and endeavors. So I'm wondering, does this seem, I mean, this emphasis to subjectivity in some way seem to be compatible with your project? Or another way to ask that is, what is the role of subjectivity in the counterhuman imaginary, especially because you keep talking about project. You use the word project a lot. So what do you think?
I'm just jumping back to my comment about the it narrative from the 18th century. The fact that it narratives occasionally, for some 21st century critics, are described as fables, makes me try to think through their fabular scenario in relationship especially to and possibly relevant to this question of subjectivity. In other words, what happens to the idea of subjectivity when a chair is doing the talking, or a guinea? And the it narrative does a really interesting combined engagement with objects that do the talking and become the subject and become the definition of subjectivity, and animals. So there's a kind of, the audience in the period was reading stories told by guineas, where guineas were the author and writer and speaker, and stories told by mice, and then dogs, and then eventually the dogs dominated in the 19th century. But the equation of the guinea subject and the animal subject was very fluid for 18th century readers and writers of these pseudo fables. So it's making me believe that the scenario of subjectivity is an ongoing issue that can reach out past or beyond, or that can include objects, chairs, animals, and humans in terms of how we might understand and define subjectivity, sort of opening up the category of subjectivity by means of the vitality of the guinea.
And just to follow up on that, so you would see your project as compatible with somebody like Bruno Latour, or yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yes, I think I would. Yeah.
Okay, we have a little bit of time. If anybody else in the group would like to follow up on new materialism and the fable.
Are there any comments in the comment section?
I have a question. So I think that the plague, the role of the plague in the fable is very interesting. But what is your sense about the earth, the role of the earth in that fable? Because it's that kind of fable is quite interesting. It's all about animals, not humans. But it looks like they are determining the border between us and it, just as like the Jane Bennett says, and they go scaling down, and then the border is drawn between us and the rest of the animals, in a sense. Yeah, so like the two it, which is the one us who get the who become it and therefore being killed and sacrificed and also plague. Yeah, but how do you feel about the role of that animal?
Right.
I think that might be for you, Lucinda.
Oh, I was afraid you'd say that. I'm how do I feel? I mean, I think that then we get into a mode of, symptomatic reading. If we read it allegorically, then, the ass is very much, stands in for a whole political hierarchy and the animal hierarchy is just that, mirrored in humans, which is pretty much what you see, in a tradition of animal literature all the way to Tarzan, Tarzan of the apes, Tarzan the ape man, that sort of thing. Having said that, I actually believe that there is an ethics, which is something I want to talk about later. That seems to be part of what Laura's calling the counterhuman imaginary, even though, is it fair to say, Laura, that you don't necessarily focus on that very much?
Right, I don't. Right.
Yeah, as one might in like a traditional history of sensibility or something like that. And that ethics is, I do want to talk about this later, but I'm not sure if literary, humanism can survive without an ethics. Let me just put it that way. And that's probably all I have to say about that at the moment.
Well, oh, please go ahead, Tobias.
Hey everybody, nice to see all of you. And I'm happy to be involved in this conversation and talking about Laura's new book. So yeah, the question that came to mind about this conversation so far is, thinking about some of the critiques of new materialism in terms of, to use old-fashioned language, what could be described as a kind of commodity fetishism. When you're describing like things as they really are, independent of any relationality, but often, or probably in almost all cases, what we're actually talking about are commodities that have been, produced through human labor, exchanged through human markets, valued and possessed. When I think about it narratives, often what they seem to be trying to represent is a kind of social totality that's emerging through growing capitalism, through the emerging world market, through the nation state, through new infrastructures. So what they often try to do is use a given object or animal to kind of circulate through this emergent social totality revealing something about a set of relations that are nowhere evident to any single observer. And I think, you know, when I read some of the thing theory and some of the new materialism, in the emphasis on like the thing in itself and its kind of agency, it seems to be moving away from a theory of agency as fundamentally relational that would allow us to understand something like capitalism or empire or the nation state or infrastructure, any of these things that actually are connective and relational. So yeah, I kind of wonder, you know, and also, Laura, I'm thinking about your early work. I was just pulled off my shelf a book that I read many years ago and learned a lot from your book on Pope, your book on fables of modernity. Both really center on an understanding of the 18th century as defined by this reckoning with this emerging capitalist world system. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, like, what happens to that, and more theoretically, what happens to a relational understanding of agency that could account for something like capitalist social relations?
Yeah. Well, that's really a fundamental question for me, and it's and it's very relevant to the course of my thinking about the period right now. I completely agree with you that new materialism is, in its particular definition of agency and vitality, is setting aside the historical and the scenario of relationality. And so, yeah, for me, that's problematic in certain fundamental ways. I'm thinking, though, that utilizing some of the utilizing new materialism as an opportunity for a distinctive formal engagement with a text, rather than with the text relationship to history or society or even culture, provides a way of uncovering, or provides a way of not engaging, provides a way provides an indication of symptomatic dimensions of the text that are relevant to something outside of the human. So once I take my premise in this book, which is that I'm trying to enable us to make our way methodologically to some form of recognition of the counterhuman in literary texts, then new materialism becomes a useful formal tool. What you do when you step outside of the text's agency or engagement, or what you do when you get into the realm of the counterhuman, I'm not quite sure, because it's really, to me, this book is pointing out opportunities to appreciate, and we'll get there when I get to the post critique, opportunities to appreciate the way texts are no longer human. And there's real problems with my previous historical criticism when I encounter fables of modernity from the perspective of the counterhuman. I'm not quite sure what to do next. So yeah, so thank you. That's an excellent question, and it's really relevant.
Yeah, thanks, Tobias, and nice to see you. If there are no more questions pertaining to new materialism, shall we go on to affect?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think affect is maybe more conducive to it maybe might provide us with answers to some of the questions that have arisen here in relationship to thing theory. So anyway, the affective turn. Here I have a long quote from Brian Masumi. I think his account of affect in this LA Times interview is a perfect resource for the key concepts for affect theory. So he says, and I'm going to read this at length, a power to affect and be affected is a potential to move, act, perceive, and think. In a word, powers of existence. The to be affected part of the definition says that a body's powers of existence are irreducibly relational. They can only be expressed in dynamic relation with other bodies and elements of the environment. The power to affect and the power to be affected are inseparable. They are two sides of the same coin. They are reciprocals, growing and shrinking as a function of each other. So from the start, affect overspills the individual, tying its capacities to its relational entanglement with others and the outside. Affect is fundamentally trans-individual. The word power here is, in the first instance, not power over, it is power to. Affect grasps life from the angle of its activity, its exuberance, its drive to express always more of a body's powers of existence or potential to be, in an always irreducibly relational way, in attunement with the affordances of the outside. And another resonant term, like Masumi's entanglement, is Melissa Gregg and Gregory Sigeworth's term in-betweenness in their introduction to the affect theory reader. They define it as affect as the capacities to act and be acted upon. Affect is an impingement or extrusion of a momentary or sometimes more sustained state of relation, as well as the passage and the duration of passage of forces or intensities. That is, affect is found in those intensities that pass body to body, human, non-human, part body, and otherwise. So in terms of rethinking fables, maybe affect theory enables us to consider how the intensities of the fable arise through the passage of affect or through a relational entanglement or in-betweenness that goes beyond the individual. We might consider whether the fable challenges the traditional ontological concepts by depicting or engaging cross-species intimacies that multiply or destabilize conventional representations of affinity or coherence or identity. And that would result in a fundamental questioning of a human-dominated and exclusively human notion of affectivity, then in turn destabilizing conventional definitions of the human. So this engagement with affect may be a dimension of the fable's innovative interventions in relationship to literary form or even literary history. That is, in exploiting this kind of affective in-betweenness or relational entanglement, the fable might be providing for an imaginative site for other than human transpositions, placing various beings, including humans, into surprising, direct, intimate contact with other beings. And this kind of contact would propel the imaginative experience beyond the bounds of convention and create a new framework in which interrelationality, efficacy, and intimacy, and even being itself can be reimagined through the fable. So maybe the fable's innovations along these lines contrast with or impact conventional narrative forms in literary history. So yeah, I'm open for Lucinda's observations.
Well, my first observation, just to go back to, animals sick with the plague, is that it makes affect, I think, would play an important role in reading that fable because of the simultaneous emergence of certain kinds of, epizootic cattle diseases and the Black Death and bubonic plague. And so there was a sense of identification or sometimes disidentification, in a sense that the body was not so very different. If even within the Exodus narrative, those were all multi-species plagues, not really distinguished from one another. But it's the role of the body here that that I'd like to talk about. You don't mention Stacey Alamo in your work, but I'm sure I know her work. Her work, and that there's always been a kind of friction between her work and which rests upon the idea of transcorporeality and object-oriented ontology, or anything, Timothy Morton, probably, thing theory too. And the way she describes transcorporeality, and I think this is deeply related to, both Tobias's questions and, and questions that will emerge. It's an ontology. As an ontology, it doesn't exclude any living creature. It does begin with the human in order, paradoxically, perhaps, to disrupt Western human exceptionalism. That's what Stacy says. So that in some ways sounds very much like an instance of the counterhuman that you identify as being part of the counterhuman imaginary. But unlike Bennett or Morton, Alemo is less interested in a gentle realism as an ontology than in dissolving, and this is Alemo again, the figure-ground relationship between the human and the environment. She writes, transcorporeality finds itself within capitalism, but resists the allure of shiny objects, considering instead the effects they have while reckoning with the strange agencies that interconnect substance, flesh, and place. And for her, this interest emerges from environmental health and environmental justice movements. And it doesn't mean that, quote, everything is connected, which is kind of the woo-woo quality that, that a gentle realism is sometimes rightly or wrongly associated with. But it involves, science and science studies and citizen science and, and all kinds of political movements. Transcorporeality, she says, grapples with how the transformation of the world alters or should alter ontologies, epistemologies, politics, and ethics. So I'm saying, and I know that your emphasis on the formal is different from this, but my question is, how does it matter if the body, and particularly the transcorporeal body, is at the center of this counterhuman imaginary?
Yeah, that's a really, really relevant and interesting addition to the approach I was offering around affect theory. I think the body is extremely valuable. Representations of engagements with the body are extremely valuable in thinking about the counterhuman, and also about the whole scenario of relational entanglement across species. And a good example is the lapdog poetry, which I am especially interested in my book. And it's not just that the poems are, some of them are written by the lapdog. So some of them are spoken by the lapdog the way the it narrative is spoken by the coin. But invariably, the lapdog poetry is a formal scenario, a generic scenario in the 18th century where bodies are merging. And the in-betweenness of the actual corporeal scenario of the woman's body and the animal's body are in a constant state of contact, or in this, you can't separate them, in unseparatableness. And that's a really significant point of reference and even lesson for thinking both about the counterhuman, which seems to emerge from the entanglement of bodies in the lapdog poetry, almost beyond the intentional or rational perspective of the poet. But it's relevant there, but it's also relevant to thinking more broadly about the fable as a place where we might look especially for points of entanglement between or across animal species, or between animals and humans. And I'm thinking about the plague, the animal sick of the plague. I was reading the poem by La Fontaine, which does a quick job with the problem, and the speech of the animals and the animals' input into the scenario of the discussion of who to execute is really a kind of, utilizing the plague as a means of generating entanglement of animal bodies. So So it's awfully productive, I think, to think about Stacy Alimo but especially to think about the representation of the body in this context.
Thank you. Does anybody want to say anything, or do you have about affect? I have another question, but don't have to ask it. Any questions in the chat? Well, let me just ask this really quickly. And it is again about ethics. And I've always been, well, you know, that you mentioned you have your quotation from Gregg and Siegworth, an inventory of shimmers. And shimmer is Deborah Bird Rose and others, you know, translation of an Aboriginal term, biryun, which is an aesthetic that is not textual. It pervades ritual and dance and everything else, which she regards as comparable to Isabel Stenger's notion of reciprocal capture, in which, quote, neither entity transcends the other or forces the other to bow down. And I think you kind of mentioned a version of reciprocal capture, you know, earlier.
Yeah.
So for Bird, both simmer and reciprocal capture are calls in the midst of what's the sixth extinction crisis to engage in forms of scholarship that encourage what she calls passionate immersion in the lives of both humans and non-humans. So one of my questions is, and I hope these don't sound like gotcha questions, Laura, because your work is so important to me. You know, I ask these questions because I'm working through these things at the same time. Is the project of formalism inimical to passionate immersion, and the that can have an effect on issues like the sixth extinction crisis?
Well, I think, not to just go on to the next point, but I think I try to answer that very directly when I talk about the notion of reparative reading or post-critique from the perspective of the counterhuman. No, I think that uncovering the right metaphor never comes to me, but I think directing attention within literary texts, formal attention to the opportunities for the intrusion of the counterhuman upon the human, really directly leads to a kind of engagement with the text, which is very different from you know, our very different from our typical mode of critique, and and does move us toward the ethical in direct ways, because it can be appreciative in the sense of taking the text seriously for what it does beyond the human. So yeah, so I don't develop that very fully in this book, but I think that I need to go back there and help myself make the transition from my my other work, which is, you know, so attentive to historical context, make the transition from there to the counterhuman in, you know, in some systematic way. And I'm going to go there, but I don't know. I think as I begin to work more intensely on environmental, other scenarios around the environmental context, that might be the place.
You know, Tom Van Doren, and I'm kind of sorry he's not here, but he's probably sleeping or something at this point, being Australian. He has a little piece in environmental humanities called Care, which has been really important to me in teaching environmental writing, which I do. I teach environmental writing to scientists. But, you know, he makes the point that, well, let's see how he puts it better than I do, that it's always, you know, caring is always the unsettling obligation of curiosity, which is becoming with, but not in that old Heideggerian, you know, term of becoming with, because it involves bodies, it involves touch, He says, touch peppers its partners with attachment sites for world making, draws us into complex interwoven histories of coevolution and broader patterns of co-becoming. And I was thinking about that in terms of your description of the fable, and that, you know, we can't touch the fable. So yes, it's an imaginative project, but there maybe what we need is, you know, a broader definition of touch that is grounded in the specificities of real bodies and world and ongoing relationship. He says, care is always the project of worlding. And I've found that so fruitful. And talking to scientists, for example, you know, teaching would-be scientists, practicing scientists about this. And it's something that they don't have either, the scientists. That they don't necessarily have this caring. Some of them do. But this touch, this caring can potentially become a way not only relating to fables, but maybe the Counterhuman Imaginary is the space at which science and literature can talk to each other too. That's kind of what I'm suggesting. Yeah. I don't know.
That's a great thought. One way of understanding the ongoing problem of the counterhuman, the counterhuman is right now my attempt to answer the question of how we be ethical without being humans in control. And it's the whole, you know, underlying debate about the Anthropocene, where it's you know, it's named for the human, it belongs to human science. How do we take responsibility? How do we appreciate? How do we grasp? How do we touch the other than human without implicitly accepting and even furthering the, you know, power of the human over of the human.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's just an ongoing for everybody, an ongoing issue. And so I guess the question I'm seeking to explore is, if we develop formal methodological resources along the lines that I'm trying to describe as relevant to the counterhuman, does that put us in a different position in relationship to the realization of our ethics than if we're asserting human ethical control?
Yeah. I like that you put it that way. There is one question in the chat. I'm not sure if it's been answered. Can you see this, Laura? I'm currently planning to look at human and non-human interaction in fables. I'm wondering if affect theory helps in this case. Has any intersection with eco-criticism? Maybe you would like to, the person who wrote this, would you be interested in contributing and saying anything about that, about your own project? Okay, well, if you change your mind, please do. Laura, do you want to say something about that quickly?
I guess I am very interested in fable examples of human non-human interaction, and I guess I'm less well versed in the bibliography of fables, but most of the fables I can think of right now don't have that happening. They have the animals doing it, or they're not privileging the human in a way that, for me, makes me remember and identify a human non-human scenario. And you know, that if that's true, that might be a relevant issue for the fable as a form, that the animals, where are the humans? They're there, but in a different and kind of non-bodily format.
You know, interestingly, humans tend to show up in a lot of rat fables.
Oh, okay.
Which, yeah. So that's what I was thinking about in relation to that. And that kind of makes sense, because, as you know, they're kind of the other of the animal world, and so in constant, you know, competition with, friction with the human, so their subjectivity is almost always defined in relation to that connection. Maybe we should move on to post-critique.
Yes. Yes, Tobias.
I just wanted to follow up and pose question about fables and the position of humans in fables and how it might relate to this conversation about the Anthropocene human. My understanding is that often where the human appears in the fable is as the interpretant, as the reader, and a kind of humanness is realized in that position of reading, often a kind of reading that we might not call symptomatic reading, but that's also, I don't know if it's exactly reparative reading or surface reading. It definitely involves kind of reading past the manifest content and identifying something like a human value, a human ethics, and thus an understanding of what the human is in the content of the fable, right? So that the human is kind of like a potentiality that is kind of structurally positioned alongside that of the implied reader of the fable. So, I think that has some real implications also for thinking about the earlier conversation about textuality and reading as opposed to other kinds of relationality that are non-textual, and whether there's a very specific kind of humanness, a very specific conception of the human that would be aligned with the act of reading and being the interpreter of a fable. But then I think this comes back to the question of, what kind of human do we want to imagine and theorize as adequate to an Anthropocene moment where humans in our collective activity are able to fundamentally rearrange Earth system processes, and it seems that we need more than just a kind of post-human fantasy of the escape from humanness, the escape from human responsibility. In terms of intellectual history, for me, like one of the big questions is how did we go from, a decade or so where everyone was a post-humanist and we were kind of done with humanness, and then suddenly we find ourselves in this Anthropocene conversation. It's like the human is everywhere now. The human is the very thing that we can never kind of get outside of. But, coming back to this kind of problem of the human that's produced in the reading of the fable, does that help us to think about a principle or theory of the human adequate to our Anthropocene entanglements?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm thinking partly, I'm a little bit paraphrasing what you said, that the human is almost always already behind the premise of the fable, in the sense that you described as the perspective against which the fable is meant to offer judgments or opportunities for understanding the scenario presented by the fable, so that there's a humanness, that's human identity, that's always already managing the fable because of the fable itself. Maybe I'm offering a definition of the fable that's not very fair, but I'm wondering whether there aren't points of contradiction between that always already human power and that's presumed in the fable and other modes of representation of the human, maybe bodily ones, of the human body in relationship to animal bodies, other opportunities in which the human plays a different role, has a different, offers a different perspective on the scenario of the fable. And, that's just a project for reading fables closely and discovering other humans, in addition to other than human beings. Should we go to post-critique?
Yeah, I just want to add something before we move on, that Michel Serres does consider, his book, The Parasite, a fable. So I don't know, which is kind of interesting in relation to this conversation. Please, post-critique.
Yes, really interesting. Okay, so let's turn to post-critique finally, which, is a version of what we now refer to as a reparative reading or surface reading. And here I'm very dependent on Rita Felsky and Elizabeth Anker from their introduction to their collection, Critique and Post-Critique, since I feel like they reflect and summarize a current self-conscious conceptualization of this trend. Post-critique reflects a turn away from the skeptical, diagnostic, symptomatic, suspicious, oppositional modes of analysis that characterize modern literary theory until recently and criticism. So here's a passage from Felsky and Anker's introduction. First, they describe critique as a genre in order to go on to counter critique with post-critique. So here is critique. While the association of critique with self-questioning extends back to Kant, it is heightened and intensified in the dramas of exposure that characterize contemporary forms of interpretation. Whatever is natural, taken for granted, essentialized, or transparent becomes the critic's target. Such qualities are seen as not only theoretically inadequate in failing to acknowledge the linguistic and cultural construction of reality, but also politically troubling in naturalizing social phenomena and thereby rendering them immune to criticism and change. As a result, critique has encouraged a recurring preoccupation with second-order or meta-analysis and a seemingly inexhaustible relay of skepticism and disclosure. Hermeneutic insight emerges only to become the object of further suspicion, lest it fall prey to the stable, authentic, or authoritative knowledge that critique seeks to challenge. Demanding a hypervigilance on the part of the critic, critique thus requires stringent self-critique and continued attempts to second-guess or problematize one's own assumptions. So the broad effort of post-critique is the opposite of this skepticism. The effort is to highlight an immediate engagement with the text, and this engagement involves, as Felsky and Anker say, quote, treating texts with respect, care, and attention, emphasizing the visible rather than the concealed, in a spirit of dialogue and constructiveness rather than dissection and diagnosis. What gets built and shaped when a critic reads? What affordances and opportunities does literary form and experience open up? So the aim is surface reading or reparative reading or thin description, which foregrounds affirmation of the text project and appreciation of its embodiment of a certain aim, and immediacy of engagement with that aim on the part of the reader, and a kind of autonomy on the part of the text that emerges from that experience and from that readerly attention. Jonathan Culler, for example, uses the phrase capacious appreciation of the text when he is seeking to summarize his definition of his approach to poetry in his theory of the lyric. Quote, our attention should be directed to experiencing the poem itself as an event. So what if in reading the fable, we make a commitment to experiencing the fable as an event? That is, focusing on the experience of its representation of the other than human as a first-order readerly event. Then we might say the fable directly proposes through its distinctive engagement with the other than human some kind of grasp of the experience of intra-activity across species boundaries and affects. That is, our approach to the fable would entail not just an account, but an appreciation of how a literary work might grasp the human reader capaciously in relationship to realms of agency, vitality, entanglement, affect, being, beyond the human. we would want to be open to the scenario of rethinking or to the undermining of conventional human structures and processes. So in uncovering or discovering the ontological complexities or the agency and vital force or the relational entanglement generated by the fable, we would seek to take those innovations or experiences on their own terms as a distinctive imaginative event. And so, for example, in the Counterhuman Imaginary, what I'm claiming in the broadest sense is that this engagement, or a systematic methodological means of engaging with the other than human as a force in the literary text, can offer a new kind of so-called first order post-critique experience of the impact or even the presence of the other than human through human creativity, in the sense of providing for an immediate grasp of the self-efficacy of matter, a sustained implication in interactivity, or a radical overwriting of species boundaries and of affects. It's not in the human creator's conscious shaping of an assessment of the other than human. And it's not in our deconstruction of that human creator's shaping and assessment, but it's in an appreciation of how the counterhuman even usurps the human text. And so how a text might grasp the reader through the lens of the counterhuman, outside of or beyond the human creator's intentionality. And I guess that's what I meant when I was alluding to the idea of discovering an ethics by means of stepping outside of the human, the powers of human creativity and into some counter scenario that's not accountable directly or consciously shaped by the human. So what do we think?
A lot. I mean, your description of the storm and, you know, the environmental chapters were, I mean, really fascinating to read. And also the coda, which, you know, deals with Tobias's work. So Tobias, I'm sure you're going to have things to say here, but let me just start with a general principle having to do with skepticism and its relationship to environmentalism. I mean, here's what I was thinking when I was reading that chapter, that it's been said that, you know, that humanism, particularly our hermeneutics of suspicion, have led to a kind of, you know, melancholy skeptic that's incapable of doing anything except critique, and which is not the subject that, you know, one needs to have in the middle of the Anthropocene and the sixth extinction event, right? Somebody who's just who can only do that. Then there's a thought that both vital materialism, affect theory, even post-critique are, for better or worse, just ways of you know, responses to this is the skeptical melancholy of humanism, because they involve this openness in, you know, some way to something outside themselves, sort of like what everybody says when you do when you have a panic attack. You know, you have to touch things, you have to, you know, smell things, you have to feel things. So, you know, that so it's kind of a therapeutic method. I guess where I got hung up a little bit is in the idea of the method living just beyond any system that human theory can confirm. And I don't know that you necessarily meant this, but on the one hand, it sort of smacks of the sublime, that the just beyond is, you know, is associated with the sublime, that it's beyond the imagination. At the same time, though, from an environmental perspective, that in the face of all the climate deniers and you know, there is I think maybe an outsized effort to try to for better or worse, reaffirm the reality of these events. That they are not just beyond, that they may be a matter of record, but they're also a matter of lived and felt experience. Crop failures, for example, the floods, things like that. Yeah. You quote, I think, Courtney Wise Smith on the I think it's on the storm, and all the records of the storm. And you do have that kind of recording, particularly in relation in Defoe, but it's also true that these things happen to real animals who were trapped on hills in this flood, and that things died. So that's just kind of a mess I'm throwing at you. And I guess I can summarize it by saying, in a question that maybe you've already answered, especially in relation to environmental issues, how do you imagine your emphasis on, just beyond the imagination pertaining to our need to grapple with the reality of climate?
Mm. Yeah, that's such a good question. And I do want to, Tobias, acknowledge your influence on my thinking about environmental issues here, which turn out to be weirdly different than the animal studies scenario that I kind of started with when I began this book. So the book grew from animal studies to storms got added late, and then earthquakes got added way at the end. And when I got to earthquakes, I'm like, whoa, there's more of this. And I'm just only I'm only at the beginning of my thinking about this, whatever, eco-other thing. But I agree. What's really ironic or paradoxical or problematic maybe in my account of the storm, but also the Lisbon earthquake, is the contradiction in my methodology between the representation of lived experience. Like Defoe wanted to know what everybody experienced. And so he just got dozens of responses of firsthand, it happened yesterday, I'm in the middle of the storm right now, accounts of what happened to people in the storm across the British Isles. He was so committed to then taking the lived experience and putting it in the public eye. And even similarly with the earthquake, the accounts of how people perished in the earthquake and the tidal wave. There's a really paradoxical or ironic or problematic relationship between the visceralness of lived experience in Defoe and in the Lisbon and in the earthquake poetry of the 18th century, and what I'm claiming to discover as the ways in which we might uncover the manifestations of the other than human. And I don't have an answer yet. What I did with the earthquake poetry is I took all how mean is this? I took all the accounts of lived experience and I lined them up, and then I compared them to every other account of an earthquake that ever happened, and I saw that they were just unbelievably conventional. They were lived. The person was there, but the words and the images were from classical times to the moment of the earthquake, the most conventional representations of the massive death toll. And so I'm reducing the visceral lived experience of the literature to a claim that it's conventional melodrama. And I'm discovering something about the engagement with the eco-other in some other formal structural scenario in those poems or in Defoe's account of the storm. So I just give up right now because I see how, I think maybe what I need to do and what I should learn from this conversation is bringing that more directly to consciousness, that paradox, in terms of my methodology, and making it play being more self-aware, and then seeing what kind of a role I can enable that to play conceptually.
Tobias, you want to jump in here?
Sure. Yeah, I guess that paradox kind of sounds to me like a version of what I take critique to be, or even symptomatic reading, and I guess this is where I push against some of the post-critique methodologies, is what seems to me to be a kind of misconception of what critique is and has been, which to me is just a dialectical form of thinking that's actively working to connect kind of what's seen or known and what's not seen or what's not known, that's actively working to relate, the conditions of a given connection, and how that particular connection is also shaped by non-connection. What occurs within the text, what's made visible or known within the text, how's that related to what's outside the text? The acknowledgement of what's outside the text, or not what's not brought within textual representation, doesn't somehow fundamentally delegitimate what is being represented. And I think that's kind of the mistaken version of critique, that somehow by drawing attention to what's not being said, we're saying that what's being said is kind of fundamentally inadequate, or defined by some repression or obfuscation. To me, it's a mode of thinking that recognizes that we're always thinking within constrained affordances of a given mode of thought or genre or discipline, that always also leaves something outside. I think for us in the humanities, and particularly those of us working in literary studies, we're always, I think, called to think about the relation between our modes of inquiry and scientific modes of inquiry. So for me, or system science and ecology provide tools that connect up in really difficult, uncomfortable ways to textual analysis and cultural analysis. And kind of thinking about that non-relation as well as that potential relation or dialogue is what I think of as the basis of kind of critique, as a dialectical approach to texts or to disciplines and modes of thought. So, I think that's kind of where that conversation just ended up with that paradox, is, to me, yeah, like a limit in some of the post-critique models of critique, and I guess particularly in Felsky's work, sometimes I feel like her project is this critique of critique, kind of paradoxically, and she often draws on the tools of critique precisely to critique what she calls critique. So yeah, that's, I guess, my takeaway here.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I'll just add a quick comment that you inspired me to think, which is I too, so much of my work has been critique, and the fact that the text always leaves something outside, as you said, is been fundamental to my engagement with literary texts. I think what I'm trying to do here, and this is what I need to bring to consciousness in relationship to the counterhuman, is that the something that's left outside, that I might have discovered in another mode of, say, Marxist analysis, is one thing. There's another outside. There's another realm of the left out. There's another scenario of the outside that I'm trying to arrive at through the methodology of the counterhuman. It's not, so it shouldn't be preventing an attention to and a critique of the stuff, the something outside that we bring to bear when we think about capitalism or consumption or commodification or circulation in relationship, say, to the it narrative. It shouldn't deny that outside, but it's adding a different kind of outside that arises from a different mode of analysis. But thank you very much. Yeah, super useful.
Well, we have about 6 minutes. If anybody would like to jump in here, Donna, you've been awfully quiet.
It's just it's just a moment, a historical moment in which I'm listening and trying to absorb. It often takes things time to sort of percolate.
You mean in terms of thing theory, in terms of what's going on?
Approaches to the fable,
Oh, I see. I see.
And how to move this forward.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
I would only be going backward because the case study that I've been working on is very much a cross species thing, but it's certainly very animal-y rather than counter-human. I need to think more about what other dimensions of this particular scenario might be susceptible to that kind of opening up beyond human animal.
Raises some important questions, doesn't it? Tobias, did you want to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to ask a question for Laura. I haven't had a chance to look at the new book yet, but I'm looking forward to doing so. But I'd love to hear more about the choice to term this phenomenon the counterhuman, which seems like an alternative to the non-human and the inhuman. And insisting on something actually a little bit more oppositional and relational than is implied by the non-human, which seems agnostic to the human, whereas the human seems like it's in some way positioned against the human.
Yeah, it was a big debate. It was an ongoing debate. It lasted like 3 years, and there was transhuman and posthuman and non-human and inhuman and other than human. And I couldn't get away from the counterhuman. And I'm going to say that emerges from my, kind of long-held perspective on the human in relationship to the modes of representation that I've been dealing with. That is that for me, what I cared most about in documenting the opportunities to discover reflections, some kind of distant scenario intrusions of other than human stuff, animals. For me, the purpose of that was all along an ongoing, even if it's only implicit, challenge to human power, human centrality, human authority, and human autonomy. And so I really wanted I wanted my term to be explicitly about the challenge to the human. The book doesn't sufficiently explain that premise. And so, yeah, that's almost like an ideological claim that I'm making about the purpose of the methodology that I'm introducing. But yeah, it's a terrific question.
So Laura, do you think that the posthuman is dead?
No, I don't think so. But I think it's gonna be scattered and be manifested in a range of different ways. And so, thinking about the status of the animal in relationship and what's happening in animal studies, thinking about about environmental studies, thinking about the role of artificial intelligence and the machine, the dimensionality has gotten too large for the term. So I guess we're just going to have to be confused and cope with the growing scope of the whatever is happening to the human.
I think that's Rosie Berdotti's point too. Or if we want to go back to Eve Sedgwick, who said we're best off with a large gene pool of possible modes of inquiry.
Yeah, right. Good point.
Well, we're probably at time, unless anybody has a burning question. Cowrie, did you want to close it off?
Okay. Yeah. So thank you so much. It was very useful, and then I made a lot of notes. Yeah. So thank you so much for Laura and Lucinda for doing this one.